All right, AMP1 students, in this video we are going to talk about the second type of ossification that happens for the formation and development of bone in the human. All right, so I'm going to go to our objectives. So in the last video we talked about intramembranous ossification and identified which bones, which there weren't that many, were produced by that type of ossification. And then we looked at the four main steps on how the mesenchyme, that embryonic connective tissue, is transformed or changed into the bone tissue. So we have another type of ossification that happens, and this one is the more prevalent type because the majority of our bones are going to develop through this type of ossification. And they call it endochondral ossification. So that means like inside, endo. Chondral means cartilage, so it's kind of happening inside cartilage. And so the framework or scaffolding or template for this type of bone formation is hyaline cartilage. So we're going to look at the steps that happen with the endochondral ossification. All right, so I'm going to go to back to our textbook. And so this is the image that shows we got the little progression of endochondral ossification. And it definitely happens in our long bones. That's how our long bones are going to form by this endochondral ossification. But realize a lot of other bones do as well. So I'm going to enlarge this just a little bit so we kind of zoom in here. Okay, so first thing to realize is that the framework or tissue that develops first in endochondral ossification is called the hyaline cartilage. So that hyaline cartilage, as you can see, it'll form pretty early on, about 8 to 12 weeks. I'm going to zoom in on our little fetus here. So this is showing that hyaline cartilage will develop, and it'll be like the same shape, essentially, of our bone. So like that's the little humerus bone, and so the radius and ulna here would look like what they should look like. We'd have the femur bone and the tibia and fibula. So those are our skeletal system starts out as made of, most of our skeletal system starts out made of this hyaline cartilage. And realize there's like a little bit of layer, a little protective layer around that hyaline cartilage. They call it the perichondrium. But realize that layer has some cells in it that are stem cells. So those are cells that can differentiate into another cell. So that's important to realize for this whole process. Okay, so we have the little cartilage model that develops first. So majority of our bones will be hyaline cartilage and have that little layer around them. All right, so then when we continue to grow, the first thing that's going to happen is, for the formation of bone tissue, is that we're going to have the little chondroblast and chondrocytes that are in that hyaline cartilage. They'll get the signal to enlarge, and they'll start to die off. And when they do that, they leave these big open cavities around them too. So they'll start to die off, and that allows for space for blood vessels to grow into that area. So remember, our bones are very vascular. They have a lot of blood vessels. So this is the first step in getting blood vessels inside our bone. So we'll get a blood vessel growing into the center of our bone here. And then that little pericardium that we mentioned before, that has little stem cells, and those little stem cells will come into this area too, and they will differentiate or transform into osteoblast. And so then the osteoblast will use that little kind of that little template of the hyaline cartilage that's here to start producing osteoid. Remember, it's producing like collagen. Now, I keep pointing to the middle. But really, the first place that the bone will form is actually along the sides of the diaphysis. So remember this slender, narrow shaft in the middle is the diaphysis. It'll actually form along the sides first. And they call that a bone collar because it's just forming around the sides. But then, again, the blood vessels start to move into the center there, and so do the osteoblasts that came from the surface, that perichondrium, sorry. And then they will start to form the bone tissue here in the center of the diaphysis. And since this is the first major place where you get bone formation, they call this the primary ossification center. So it'll kind of like start right here, and then it'll kind of spread out toward the epiphyses in this direction. Right now it looks like it's all there at once, but it actually starts at a little bitty area here, and then bone continues to form out away from that little ossification center and move towards the epiphyses. So the primary ossification center for bone formation is in the center of the diaphysis there. So then, after we're born, actually, is when we'll start to get bone formation occurring in the epiphyses. So in these ends of our long bones. And so it kind of happens the same way, though. We get the little blood vessels growing into that area. We get the osteoblast moving from the periosteum here, that little layer around it, into there, and they'll start forming bones. So like right here we have like two little they call them secondary ossification centers because this is the second place in this bone where the bone formed. So this being the first, which was the primary ossification center. So we'll get these little secondary ossification centers, and again they'll just continue to form bone, and it'll spread out and and change all this epiphyses, almost all of it, to bone tissue, and it'll do the same down here. So, and then as we become a child, we will have the bone tissue in the epiphyses as well as along the diaphysis. That realize that there's two places where we're not going to have bone tissue yet. One, or actually not never. One is the articular cartilage, so that little bit of hyaline cartilage that's on the end of this bone and on this distal end of this bone. That's actually the cartilage that's associated with a joint, and we want that cartilage to stay there. So, so that cartilage will remain even as we become adults. And obviously we'll talk about arthritis, and that cartilage can be damaged and worn down, and we lose it as we get older. But essentially it's there to stay, supposed to stay there. Okay, so that's one place where we'll continue to have hyaline cartilage associated with our bones. And then the other place that we will is at the epiphyseal plates, also called the growth plates. So there'll be one in the long bone, one at the distal end and one at the proximal end. So until we reach our potential height, our whatever height we're going to reach, that will remain, those like epiphyseal plates or growth plates will remain hyaline cartilage. Now eventually, once we reach our proper height, usually in our 20s, then all that hyaline cartilage will be converted to bone tissue, and then we call that closing of the growth plates. And so once the growth plates close, which just means that they're no longer hyaline cartilage, they're just bone, then we can't get any more continued growth in that bone. It's kind of reached its the highest length it will have, the largest length it'll have. So those are the two places where you'll continue to have hyaline cartilage, at least until you're in your 20s. All right. And then, obviously, this is our last picture, so our adult bone. We can usually see a remnant of where our epiphyseal plate or growth plate was, but it's all bone, so we call it the epiphyseal line. And you can see all our blood vessels and the medullary cavity, so that was kind of forming during this process where we were having some breakdown of bone, so we get that little open canal, cylindrical space in there, so that way we can have our red marrow and our yellow marrow in there. All right, so that is how our bone, the majority of our bones form in our body, is through this process of endochondral ossification. And again, it's called that because hyaline cartilage is the framework or the scaffolding that exists before the bone starts to be produced in that area. So, and again, the majority of bones are going to form this way through endochondral ossification. So there's only a few of them that form through intramembranous ossification, and we mentioned those in the last video. So if you know which ones formed by intramembranous ossification, then anything that's not them formed by endochondral ossification. All right, so I will see you in the next video, and we'll continue talking about our wonderful skeletal system. Thank you.